For most people, the greatest likelihood we will encounter up close and personal the criminal justice system is through law enforcement or policing. If you live in Washington, D.C., as I do, not only are you most likely to confront law enforcement than any other kind of criminal justice personnel, unless you work in the area like I do, but that's not very representative, but you're going to confront an absolute alphabet soup of a huge number of police agencies that you cannot even believe existed before you came to the city, and they're represented in their uniforms and in their cars and in their badges. So you'll see the DC Housing Authority Police and the George Washington University Campus Police and the Metropolitan Police Department, and of course the ones you've heard of before like the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And you'll see plainclothes police officers who work for the Secret Service a few blocks from GW at the White House and guarding important politicians. So police are really everywhere in the city, but also in our society and in our country. And that's because it is the task of law enforcement to make sure that we obey the law, and when we don't obey the law, that we are apprehended for violating the law. They're also there to try and protect the public, ensure public safety, both from criminal and non-criminal threats. So we've got a couple of different ideas going on here. The first is that we go back to a very important point we made at the outset of the course about federalism, is that there is federal, state, and local policing. In reality, the local policing by far predominate. There are more police officers at a city, town, county, or other local level than any other kind of level. If you think of many of the cop shows of the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and our current decade, a lot of them focus on city police, New York Police Department, Los Angeles Police Department, and so on. That is where the rubber hits the road in terms of policing at the most ubiquitous level, whether it's helping little old ladies cross the road, or the war on drugs, or serious crimes, or very minor crimes. And it's very, very important to realize that while we often think of the FBI when we think of police, the FBI's jurisdiction is limited to the crimes that it is mandated by statute and by law to deal with. It can't just go into a local jurisdiction and deal with a local crime. That is up to the local police. State police perhaps find themselves in the most ambiguous of situations, but most of us have experienced state police when we stopped for speeding. You wouldn't speed. Me neither. Yeah, well, sort of, kind of, right? So we've all encountered, or many of us have encountered, state police on highways, which is a place we'd often find them. There are times where federal, state, and local police work very harmoniously together. There are times when they don't work with each other because they need not work with each other. And there are times where they should work together very well and don't, and are quite competitive. All of those realities are part of the real world of law enforcement. Another aspect of the real world of law enforcement is the very many diverse kinds of policing that occur. So if any of you watched the whole public outcry after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, you might have noted that the kind of law enforcement that confronted the protesters looked much more like a military or an occupying military, with tanks and with heavy weaponry, hidden behind masks, hidden behind shields, very scary, very menacing. That's one kind of policing. On the other hand, if you are in many parks and many places around the country, you might encounter a police officer on a bicycle, on a horse, really friendly. Or if you go to a corner store, the police officer might have a table where she is sitting having a cup of coffee and a sandwich and chatting to locals. All those different kinds of policing reflect lots of different things. They reflect different philosophies of police. They reflect different needs of communities. They reflect different time periods. They reflect different politics. They reflect different budgets. So, for example, the idea that we have special weapons and tactics teams or SWAT teams really comes out of an environment that tended to emphasize in the political sphere that crime was a threat to society in some fundamental way, not dissimilar to the idea of war. In contrast, the idea of community policing said, policing can never be successful if police do not win the trust of the majority of the community, because the majority of the community are law-abiding, and people will not report crimes to the police, will not work with the police as witnesses, will not ask the police for help when they're facing crimes if they don't trust them. So police need, in that sense, to work very much with the community, not against them. They only need to work against the criminals in a community and not treat the entire community as criminal. In some ways, we are living in a kind of very split personality world of dominant ideas of policing in the United States today, because we have a coexistence of community policing on the one hand and very harsh understandings of policing, as seen in the militarized response in Ferguson as an example, that coexist. Nevertheless, there are some areas of overlap, as well as some kinds of policing that don't fall into either of those categories. So let's start off by talking a little bit about community policing. As I mentioned, community policing reflects the idea that the community is not the enemy of the police. The police are ultimately civil servants charged with public safety, and they need to work with the community and gain their trust. That doesn't mean the community become the police, not at all. It means that the law enforcement have to reach out to the community, often through organized community groups, the Rotary Club, church organizations, schools, civic organizations, and so on, to get community input about what are the crime problems and what are the crime needs and how can police serve the interests of the community. Some of the ideas of community policing arose parallel with a philosophy known as the broken windows approach. And what the broken windows approach said is that crime is likely to be encouraged, crime is likely to be incubated, or you're likely to have a more criminogenic, that term we've seen elsewhere, environment where social needs are not met, which sends an invitation or a hint to criminals that this might be a space where they can come into because the authorities are not engaged. And so the idea of broken windows was that quite literally, if there is a broken window in a community, law enforcement needs to report that to appropriate authorities to get it fixed, because if not, the area beneath the broken windows might start being a place where people who are engaged in illegal activities start to collect because they believe that that area is not being watched by the government, and in this case, the representatives being law enforcement. That idea of broken windows can and often does quite easily slide into an idea that at first glance might seem to be the opposite of community-based policing, but is not necessarily, and that is the idea of zero tolerance. Zero tolerance suggests that police should not have any discretion and all behaviors, irrespective of the context, should be dealt in the same way. Every semester I ask my students how many of you had zero tolerance policies in high school, and certainly students who went to public high schools almost always put up their hands. This is the idea that school officials are not going to ask before punishing all kids involved with the fight, rather than ask who started the fight, whose fault was it, was somebody defending themselves, for example. Likewise, in many schools, especially overwhelmingly poor and of overwhelmingly black or brown communities, those fights in the zero tolerance context are going to lead to law enforcement being called in. And so kids might actually be arrested for what might in another context be considered a schoolyard fight. In some ways, those ideas of zero tolerance are very consistent with broken windows, because it's the idea that any small thing, if unattended to, would lead to a more serious problem. So we can see how attending to those problems at the local level, the broken window, kids misbehaving, could lead to improving relations with community, because the community sees law enforcement are there trying to help them, trying to stop problems getting worse. But we can also see the opposite, how that attention to detail, that focus on zero tolerance, can lead to a community feeling like they are being treated like they are under an occupying power, and law enforcement is behaving more like soldiers of that occupying power. And certainly that was very much the case all over the country, but perhaps epitomized above all in New York City, where there are a number of legal challenges, where many people believe that stop and frisk policies were overused, so that tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of perfectly innocent people, mostly young black and brown men, were stopped and questioned by the police, who treated them as inherently suspicious. The police would argue because of the clothes they were wearing. Were they gang clothes, for example? The community would argue because of their skin color, the issue of race profiling. So we see, both for communities and for the police, there's a very careful line that needs to be managed, because you don't want to fall too much on the one side of over-policing or too much on the other side of under-policing. You don't want to be suspicious of every person because they are young and are wearing a hoodie. And you also don't want to ignore signs of an emerging threat, like a new gang that has come to an area. So police work is always going to be a reflection of different philosophies about what is the problem and what is the solution, different budgets, different politics, different time periods, and so on. So police use of force can be and often is legal. The question is, when does it become illegal? And one of the things we've seen from cases like the deaths of Michael Brown or Eric Garner is the public understanding of what is legal versus illegal use of force, and the criminal justice system's understanding of what is legal versus illegal use of force is often very different. This problem is not new. Neither the problem of innocent people being killed by police, or guilty people being killed by police, but not because they were guilty, but because of the way the interaction with police went wrong. And whose fault was it? The person being apprehended or the law enforcement? Again, opinions tend to differ enormously, and age, race, being urban or rural, your political affiliation tends to have a lot to do with that. But how to respond to that? One case that in many ways was iconic and unusual, but again, sadly, not rare, was the case of Amadou Diallo, who was a black immigrant in New York City, who was shot 41 times by New York police, who believed he was taking out a gun. That's what they said. But in fact, he was just taking out his wallet. One of the things that makes that case particularly unusual was the public anger it inspired across the country and across the world in many ways, and from all sorts of people, including Bruce Springsteen, who wrote the song American Skin or 41 Shots, in tribute to Amadou Diallo, and to discuss the problem of police use of force and when it goes wrong. The other thing that made the Diallo case unusual was it was one of the rare cases where prosecutors actually brought the police to trial. And here we see one of the most difficult and complicating aspects of how to deal with allegations of police abuse of force is most of the time when police abuse rather than use of force occurs. In other words, something that runs contrary to what law enforcement are allowed to do rather than something they are allowed or maybe even mandated to do. Police are not charged. In the rare case they are charged, juries tend to acquit them. So it's a really strange thing that for all as a society we really are worried about police abuse of force. When it comes to the jury level, we tend often to let police get away with acts that we, when we're not sitting on juries, would find illegal and inappropriate and abusive. In some ways, one of the solutions to dealing with the problem with police abuse of force as opposed to police use of force is to have much better oversight. And that is one of the byproducts of the many conversations and many discussions about law enforcement and when law enforcement goes wrong that are occurring around the United States. Some people propose civilian oversight. That tends to not be liked by law enforcement. Law enforcement also tend not to like the federal government coming in and providing oversight, but often they don't have any choice in that. And a federal investigation will pretty much show the need for federal oversight when local police are not doing their job. That doesn't mean that federal law enforcement doesn't have its own problems. It certainly does. Stepping away from the issue of abuse of force for the moment, two examples of problems within federal law enforcement are a series of scandals besetting the Secret Service and a problem with the FBI being much too white and being very bad at either recruiting or retraining top officers of color. So problems can be all over the show. In addition to federal enforcement or civilian enforcement, most police agencies have their own internal enforcement called internal affairs. It works better in some jurisdictions than others. A free press, of course, is vital. Some of the biggest problems we know about policing came about not through official channels of the criminal justice system, but through the work of citizens and journalists bringing issues to the attention of the public. So all of those things are very important potential solutions, but policing is something that we need in our society, but at the same time, we need to watch the watchmen. If the police are the watchmen, there also needs to be oversight or watching the watchmen. When police are criticized, they often point out that their work is incredibly difficult. It might be mind-numbingly boring one moment and then high stress the next moment. They might have to deal with a mentally ill person in one moment and a dangerous criminal in another. So the challenges are enormous. Depending on where you are in the United States, the pay can be good or bad, the work can be unionized or non-unionized. And so there's tremendous diversity in the kind of police work and the conditions of police work that different law enforcement agents have. Unfortunately, there's lesser diversity when it comes to diversity in terms of the makeup of law enforcement. Overall, law enforcement has become much better at becoming racially and ethnically integrated. A few decades ago, in many communities, law enforcement was overwhelmingly dominated, in some cases exclusively dominated, by white men, often of the same ethnic heritage or the same immigrant heritage, like Italians or Polish people, Italian Americans or Polish Americans. That has changed over the last few decades as more and more people of color, of different ethnicities, of different national, religious, and other backgrounds have joined law enforcement. And many police agencies have done a very good job of promoting diversity. Diversity is not just about the color of your skin or the origin of your parents or grandparents and so on. It's also about having both men and women and being able to reach out to different communities. Do you have a good relationship with different immigrant communities or with the LGBT community, for example? That's often especially important in big cities with tremendous internal diversity of their own. One of the things that sociologists have noted for many years about police work is that police tend, like most professions, to have quite distinct subcultures, except for some reasons the police subcultures are a little bit more conspicuous in certain ways than in others. And sometimes aspects of those subcultures, like an emphasis on masculinity, might make other aspects of their work or of the need to change the nature of their work, like diversity, more difficult. One of the things we'll look at right at the end of the course is the ways we can find ideas of subcultures being shared in both pro-social and anti-social groups. And we should note that police tend to have both pro-social legal subcultures, which dominate in most cases, and occasionally subcultures that encourage illegal or inappropriate behavior, whether it's sexism, racism, or financial corruption. For the most part in the United States, people who work in law enforcement obey the laws they are meant to obey. However, there are still significant challenges that haven't gone away. Although we began by talking about policing at a national level and how policing could be very different at a local, state, or federal level, in many ways it's very important to understand policing in the contemporary world and going forward into the future as a global endeavor. And that is because of a phenomenon which sociologists and others called globalization. Let me offer you this definition of globalization. It is the idea of a widening, deepening, and strengthening of economic, political, social, technological, and other ties and interconnections among multiple countries, regions, and peoples across the globe, with the result that, with both positive and negative consequences, international and multinational links and effects are inescapable. And I've drawn this definition from two scholars, Anthony Giddens and Manuela Roscoe. Now, the point of giving you that long and wordy definition is to underscore the fact that when we're talking about globalization, we are talking about much more than the idea of traveling or buying or selling to another country. We are talking about much more than study abroad. We are talking about much more than trade or crime or policing. We are talking about all of those things in the way they interact with each other. We're talking about the fact that although physically, of course, our world has not got bigger or smaller, in practice, in terms of the ways we deal with each other, we are ever more interconnected in more and more ways, in both wider and deeper ways. And that is going to affect both crime and policing, which is why we are talking about globalization. Criminals do not have to worry about rules and regulations. That's part of the advantage of being a criminal. And because of that, they are among the groups who've become quickest in the world of taking advantage of globalization. I'd argue globalization can be and is both a good and bad thing depending on what we are looking at. The analogy I always use is that globalization is like air. You have to have air. Air is everywhere around us. The question is really, is it clean air or is it dirty air? Is it air that's going to make you feel good or air that's going to make you feel bad? It's not the air itself that's a problem. And we see that point about the strengths and the weaknesses or the advantages or the disadvantages about globalization when it comes to policing and when it comes to crime, because criminals have been incredibly effective at taking advantage of a globalized universe to develop cross-border, international, multinational, and transnational crime networks. The problem, however, is that policing has not caught up. Because, for a start, policing is by definition bounded within the nation state. You do have some long-standing international cooperation between and among law enforcement agencies like Interpol. And that does allow for exchange of information that can help identify and go after criminals who are working in an international, transnational context. But in many ways, the criminals have a head start because they can use the world without the rules that bind law enforcement. To add to that, the United States was particularly slow at kind of getting up to speed at understanding what a globalizing world would mean for crime until 9/11. Since 9/11, the US has played very fast catch-up, realizing the need to work very closely with their counterparts from other countries, realizing that you can't just solve crime problems dealing with your domestic borders. You have to work between and among multiple countries, multiple languages, multiple peoples all over the world in order to police in such a way that these very complicated problems with a global reach can be addressed. And to that end, the US has become much better at sending out international agents, welcoming agents from other countries, working with them, sharing intelligence, and finding global means to combating crime when it is a global problem. It's more likely to be local than global, but when it's global, it tends to be pretty dangerous and pretty scary, whether it's cybercrime or arms trafficking. We'll look at some of the outside sources not on the video to expand our understanding of policing, but hopefully you've had an introduction to the complexity of police in this video.